BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
A couple of months ago, we made a programme called Nan the Wiser about grannies, how they influence the way we cook and have shaped how we eat. That programme triggered a feast of memories from listeners, mostly of the delicious kind and a few of the terrible.
I learned the basics of cooking first at my grandmother's apron strings. Her gravy would have won every prize going. That skill was passed down to my mother, and thence to me. It made an excellent base for mother's dustbin soup, a staple in the winter household.
On Fridays, we'd have stewed eels in pasty sauce. They wriggled in black buckets and the vendor grabbed them and nimbly chopped them on the marble slab. Nan's pasty sauce was lovely, and parsley doesn't taste the same now.
Granny and I made everything from scratch. The only unpleasant thing that comes to mind is sore finger ends from de-seeding the dried fruit for the Christmas cake.
My grandma lived in a studio flat. Whenever we went to visit, she always made a cooked lunch on a baby belling stove, and we always had tea with sandwiches and cakes. She made a lovely cherry cake.
My mum, my children's granny, was an amazing cook. She was a Scottish farmer's wife and left us with a love of food and cooking. She was famed for her shortbread, fantastic soups. She never wasted anything, but her most wonderful food was her clooty dumpling, which we had on birthdays and times of celebration.
Both my grandmothers were fabulous cooks, and my fondest memories are of standing on a little stool in the kitchen with an apron on and preparing a meal or making bread with either of them. I am a chef and own my own restaurant with my partner in Lyme Regis, and our food is all those wonderful dishes I used to cook with my grandmas. Every time I cook one of those dishes, I am, again, a young girl in my grandma's kitchen.
It was a programme that clearly touched people, which made us think there was more to say about the meaning of these rich recollections and what they tell us about our relationship with cooking and food, and also about economics, social history, culture, the power of memory. There were some stories we just had to follow up.
I am Matthew Harding. I sent you an email, which I'll read out now. Hello there. I loved your article today on grandmothers showing the way with food. My grandmother was Winifred Floyd, mother of the late Keith Floyd, and my mother Brenda. Grandma Floyd was an inspiration to all of us, growing prolific quantities of vegetables in her prize-winning garden on a Bristol council estate. We ate fresh seasonal veg all year round, learned the benefits of a truly balanced diet, and had enormous fun making everything from scratch. And I mean everything, right down to the orange squash and tomato ketchup. I have many wonderful stories about this extraordinary woman who brought up her children in Southampton during the Blitz, losing her home 3 times to German bombs whilst Grandpa was away fighting in Burma. I'd be happy to come on and talk about her if that's of interest. I'm a keen amateur chef and fascinated by food.
Well, here you are. We asked you on. Tell us a story about her then.
One of my favourite stories about Grandma, as I said, she was bringing up 2 children on her own in Southampton at a time when it was being very heavily bombed. And she always made sure that she had a hot meal to take down to the Anderson shelter with her at night. And on the night in question of the story, she had a casserole going in the oven. The air raid sirens went, so she bustled the children out of bed, grabbed the casserole from the oven with her oven gloves, and down to the end of the garden they went. She popped the casserole on the table, served up the children, and the bombs started falling. And this story came from her next-door neighbour. The Germans used to drop incendiary bombs prior to the high explosive in order to get the docks burning so that the later waves of bombers would have something to aim at. One of these incendiary bombs bounced down the steps of our Anderson shelter, spilling out flames and smoke into her shelter. Grandma very calmly put on her oven gloves, went out, picked the thing up, walked up over the top of the steps and threw it over the garden fence into next door's garden, came down, casually wafted the smoke out and went on with serving supper. My next door neighbour was A, incredulous at the fact that my grandmother had been able to do this, and B, slightly annoyed because it landed on her garden shed and burnt it down.
What a story. But I mean, she certainly set up a food dynasty with your uncle. And your mother was also a great cook?
She was undoubtedly a much better cook than Keith.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, controversially, I never really thought Keith was a particularly good cook. I mean, going to a new country or a restaurant with Keith was fantastic because he knew exactly where the food had come from, what was in it, which wine it went with. But when it actually came down to cooking it himself, it wasn't always that great. And it amuses us enormously as a family to see the lovely older French lady in the kitchen who's looking with a slightly rolling-eyed disapproval at what it is that he served up and put on the plate in front of her. I mean, of course, he cooked some fabulous stuff as well.
So the brother and sister both became really keen cooks. Did you learn most from them or from your grandmother?
I think when I was cooking with Mum, it was more of a functional experience. With Grandma, it was much more of an event, and it would start with pulling our wellies on and going into the garden, and everything was seasonal. So she would grow vegetables throughout the year, and we'd go and grab whatever it is from the garden that we were going to cook, bring it in, wash the mud off, prepare it. She had a number of little sort of wooden benches that she would stand next to the counter or the table, and we'd stand on there and be given our instructions as to what to do next and create the whole meal from scratch. And this is an ethos that I've kept with me my whole life, is that we make everything from scratch. We don't buy pre-prepared anything. We don't use processed food. With one exception, she loved OXO cubes.
Can you remember some of the dishes that she made? I mean, that you all made together.
One of my favourites would probably get a lot of the younger generation today turning their nose firmly up in the air. West Country faggots were often on the menu. And they were just the most delicious and highly nutritious meal, but with some very traditional ingredients like pig's lights, offal, and the webbing fat that you take from the inside of an animal's stomach cavity to wrap the things in. But they were absolutely delicious and incredibly cheap. And I used to help her make them probably as young as 6 or 7, I suppose.
It sounds as though there's a lot of pleasure in what your grandmother did. Not just, this is something she had to do. And in a way, when we're talking about this, we get suspicious of the nostalgia and say, well, it was relentless work. How much nostalgia is there in the way you're talking about it?
Well, I think, yes, we undoubtedly do remember things very nostalgically, and we were all sort of in awe of Grandma. But underneath that, I think she fundamentally believed that food was the centre of your life, and it was very, very important to her that we would sit down. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner was a proper meal, and we would sit down and eat together.
So many of the emails focused on that eating together, being around a table, and also on homegrown food, ingredients bought locally, and the phrase common to a lot of the messages, everything made from scratch.
At Christmas, Nan would kill one of the chickens from the yard. They were fed on boiled potato skins and bran. She'd spend all Christmas Eve gutting them and taking off the feathers. She made this soft sage and onion stuffing that was so delicious. How they concocted these meals in a kitchen with a gas cooker, one small cabinet and tiny sink amazes me.
So how did we go from this world to where we are now, where cooking seems more and more like a minority sport, and estimations of the amount of ultra-processed food in a British teenager's diet hover around 80%? It's a story we think we know, certainly a story we all have opinions about. But what's happened since cooking from scratch was the norm is complicated. Polly Russell is a food historian and curator at the British Library. She's worked on TV programmes such as Back in Time for Tea and Royal Recipes. I asked her how long it's taken us to make that jump from peeling carrots and grilling a chop to the grab-and-go microwave ping eating life that's now so common.
Well, I suppose the short answer is not really much more than one generation. So in the 1930s, and it very much depends on who you are and what class you are, because of course we have this sort of nostalgic shorthand where we say when women started working. In fact, most women have always worked, and they've also always been responsible for feeding families in the household. And so in that context, women in the 1930s, let's say most women, if they didn't have servants, would have probably been contributing to the financial household. And therefore, they're also having to deliver food or feed their families with food which is easy to prepare, quick to prepare, and probably quite repetitive because you don't have time to do incredibly original, different recipes every day, every week. You rely on a kind of system, a rota. And so the food there would have been quite, in our terms, probably quite monotonous and quite simple for many people.
Good evening. It is to you, the housewives of Britain, that I want to talk tonight. We have a job to do together, you and I, an immensely important war job. No uniforms, no parades, no drills, but a job wanting a lot of thinking and a lot of knowledge, too. We are the army that guards the kitchen front in this war.
In the Second World War, you have this moment where, in essence, the government sort of steps into the domestic kitchen through rationing, through a series of very successful education, propaganda kind of techniques to tell people what to cook and how to cook. And in a sense, that space is kind of ceded. The housewife, the mother, I suppose, of the house, kind of cedes that space to the government. And then after the Second World War, in very broad terms, you have a sort of moment where there's a gap, but very quickly that gap gets filled by food producers, food manufacturers, food retailers, then sort of step into that space where the government was. So that within a sort of 20-year period after the war, so by the sort of 70s, you have quite a highly developed manufacturing, retail, food processing system, which is delivering to consumers food which is increasingly pre-prepared and much of the labour taken out of it. And so this has kind of accelerated people's reliance on pre-prepared and packaged food and also on supermarkets in really a sort of maybe 30-year period.
I mean, you talked earlier about, granny's eating was perhaps a bit dull and, you ate the same things week after week. Well, now we've all come to believe that, we kind of have to do an ottolenghi every night. What's your take on that?
I think what the supermarkets did that was so ingenious was that in about the late 1970s and then throughout the 80s, what they realised was that they were not so much selling food as they were selling desire.
6pence off, special offer. This week's bargain. Like barkers at a fairground, the slogans shout at the passing shopper from the doorways of supermarkets up and down the country. With their long banks of crammed shelves, gondolas is the trade's picturesque name for them, their bright, gay lighting, their gleaming rows of canned goods and canned music to go with them, supermarkets are trying to bring about a revolution in our shopping habits.
They started doing the most brilliant and fantastic packaging, marketing, and also developing their food ranges so that you ended up with kind of global food available, particularly cold chain foods. Those are ready meals. But one of the consequences of that, albeit where it sort of broadened people's palates, it made this food kind of widely available. It did also start to set the bar really high. People's expectations about what they should and what they could be eating and cooking seemed to get higher in a way that's almost unrealistic now and quite burdensome.
When I look at my own mother's life, that when I was a child, she worked full time and cooked every evening and at weekends. Some of the things were repetitive, but were good. What I see when I look at the background of that is that way of cooking, of preparing meals, was propped up by an entire system of deliveries. We had, a greengrocer, a fishmonger, the grocer from the nearby town. That system, part of that system collapsed with the
with the supermarkets. And what I realized about my mother, is that she did all this marvelous stuff. But if she'd had all that convenient stuff, she would have used that, because that would have been her landscape. That would have been what was there.
Yeah, people will seek any opportunity to try and reduce the sorts of labours involved in those bits of food provisioning which are not seen as being a pleasure, which might be seen as being a chore, and particularly a daily chore, and sometimes a tyranny, I think.
As we heard from one listener, not all those grannies could cook. The listener says, I'm not sure I acquired much knowledge about cooking from my mother. My recollection of my childhood was a series of culinary disasters emanating from the kitchen. For her, the development of readily available frozen foods in the 60s must have been a real boon. She was a working mother who had little interest in cooking, which confirms much of what you're saying.
Yeah, that's a great example, Sheila, because, of course, it's not like everybody in the past, these kind of fictional, imagined and even real grannies and mothers could all cook or all enjoyed cooking. But the way in which we talk about our grannies or our mums cooking is as though everybody in the past either enjoyed it or was brilliant at it. And of course they weren't. And actually, what made a really significant difference to many women's lives was that convenience food that you've described, but also the technology that came along with it. So, you start with refrigeration and sort of everybody having access to fridges really very late in this country, just after the war. Most people end up having fridges, meaning that you can sort of stretch out and elongate out your food supply. Then the arrival of freezers, first of all in shops, but then actually people buying domestic freezers, again able to store food. Then you have things like blenders or mixers, and then eventually I guess you end up with microwaves. But this technology, all of it, is in service of reducing labour and reducing the amount of time that you have to spend thinking, preparing and storing food.
In general, our children, even when we do cook, our children less likely to be involved in the way that, 2 or 3 generations ago. I mean, my own experience is we were expected to get home from school, peel the potatoes, put the fire on, switch the oven on, do those things because we had to, because we got home before my mother did. And I think that was very, very common in working class families. But that's not the way it is now.
Well, I think that you've identified sort of a key difference. And one is that, the idea of children coming home now and sort of putting on the fire and peeling potatoes, it's really likely that you wouldn't need to do that because someone might have just bought, a ready-made, mash. So it's just not necessary. You just need to pierce the film.
Are our memories of what Granny cooked, and ate accurate? Or is there a nostalgia for a golden age? Was there a golden age?
I'm not going to claim that there was a golden age, because then you'll ask me when it was. But the question I'd ask is, whose granny and which granny and when? Because, my niece who's living here, who's in who's 25, her granny was cooking and making food in the 70s and 80s. That's a very recent granny. Now, I bet you we all have the same very fond, probably quite emotional and probably nostalgic ideas about our grannies and their food. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. One is that often your encounter with your granny or your grandparents is at a time where you're celebrating, where you're being looked after, where they have time for you, where the food that they might be producing for you is special food, it is treat food. It's not the day in, day out drudgery of providing for a family on a tight budget without a lot of time. So that encounter is nostalgic, but may also be very real because it's wrapped up with all sorts of wonderful feelings, the best feelings of family. So whenever your grandma was, whether it was in the 70s, the 80s, the 40s, the 50s, or the 30s, the chances are she probably made you a cake. She probably made sandwiches and bothered to cut the crusts off, or made you her special, pie. Well, your mum, working really hard after a day's work, is more likely to have slammed a plate down on the table and been a bit cross and short. So we have a nostalgic relationship with that food and with the idea of the grandma or the granny's food because it is produced in an emotional setting and in a setting that's surrounded with love and often warm feelings.
But nostalgia aside, are there still some serious lessons we could learn from those generations?
My name's Sophie Beckett. I'm a Public Health Research Officer at Birmingham Museums Trust, and I'm working on a project around oral histories and food, thinking about how we can use heritage as a way of thinking about healthy behaviours and food practices over time.
Sophie's been digging through a long-neglected archive of Birmingham's food memories.
The oral histories were recorded in 1984, and it's a collection of around 100 interviews with about 100 different people working mostly across the food sector in the 80s. And they're being interviewed about their life histories and their stories, but told through the kind of medium of food.
I've seen a great change in the eating habits as the youngsters have come. They don't like proper dinner. What I call proper dinner.
So what do you call proper dinner?
Well, I call proper dinner boiled potatoes and a roast potato, sprouts, peas, some collar, 2 veg, and if it's beef, Yorkshire, if it's lamb, onion sauce, mint sauce, if it's pork, stuffing and apple sauce. But it's the older ones. They've got a lot of old people who've been here donkey's years who really have that dinner. The younger ones have king rib and chips and peas. But I personally have never tasted one.
What's king rib?
I think it's pork. I've never tasted one. It's frozen.
I find myself being approached by the younger generation for advice because having been in the area for so long, word has got around that I am a butcher. I pride myself in being such, and therefore I am able to advise the younger ones, if necessary, as which is the applicable cut to what they're preparing.
These interviews have sat sort of unlistened to, undocumented for the last 40 years, so it's been my job to go through them, think about and how we can use them and what use they might be to the city in thinking about food habits over time. Creating a parallel collection 40 years on, looking at the experiences of people in the city now and comparing them to the historic collection to see how things have changed over time. So I think as part of this research, I've realised that there's been a real loss of knowledge in both sort of how people are buying ingredients and that interaction between people at the supermarkets and shoppers, and also in terms of how to cook. So I found in the 1984 collection that people really stood at the sides of their grandparents and their parents in order to learn how to cook, and lots of the aspects of cooking would pass down through generations. Whereas in the contemporary collection, I'm learning that people sort of say, I didn't really have that, and I get lots of where I learned to cook from recipes online, from social media, Instagram, TikTok. And I think part of that change is also reflected in the way that we eat. So our lunchtimes, our dinner times have evolved so massively since this sort of 1950s period, whereby people came together, they sat down over dinner time, and this was a really key part of the kind of evening setting. Whereas nowadays, I think there's so much change in the hours that people are working. The setting of the nuclear household has changed significantly, and I think this has really impacted the way in which we share knowledge and exchange knowledge.
So, if grandmas and mums and indeed granddads and dads aren't passing on their knowledge, perhaps because in 2025 many never learned to cook in the first place, what, if anything, is filling the gap? It's clear that wall-to-wall cooking on TV hasn't triggered a cooking revolution. Information about how to cook isn't in short supply. It's the doing it where people struggle. Why? Well, I went to talk to someone who's learned a lot about the barriers and how to overcome them. Alicia Weston set up Bags of Taste to work with some of the most hard-pressed and isolated groups in Britain. Bags of Taste delivers boxes of raw ingredients to people at home, teaches basic skills, and actually gets people cooking.
Well, we're in Hackney, one of those wonderful mixed-up streets of Victorian, mostly terraced houses, where we're going to meet Alicia Weston, and we are producer Beth and I, because this is Bags of Taste.
And Alicia, through Bags of Taste, is trying to deal with that really interesting question about why people don't cook, even when they know how to cook. Hello. Oh, you must be Alicia.
Hi, I'm Alicia.
Hello. We've actually come into the kitchen of Bags of Taste to sit with Alicia. You have a background in finance, you worked for the New Economics Foundation. Cooking, it doesn't seem like something that you were likely to do. What is Bags of Taste?
Well, we work with people who have multiple vulnerabilities to help them improve their diet. So that would be things like perhaps they are a single parent, but also they may have a mental health condition. They'll be likely to be on income-related benefits, but they may also have a long-term medical condition. About 80% of the people that we are working with, when they come to us, they rate their cooking skills as average to good. So they already know how to cook, but they are not cooking, and they are on average, and this is an average, bear this in mind, spending £1,260 a year on takeaways and ready meals. And these are people on low incomes. You know, in most cases, it's really about how do you motivate them to cook? How do you prove to them that this is achievable in the context, the complex context of their lives? We actually deliver the ingredients, we deliver everything they need to cook. They cook it at home, and we support them with a mentor.
And all that you're talking about goes on screens. These mentors do not meet with the...
They don't meet. So they will usually join a WhatsApp group with 2 other participants and a mentor and a staff member. And that mentor will be responsible for delivering the course to them by giving them instructions, helping them goal set, encouraging them, complimenting them on what they've done, and trying to get them through the program. And we will deliver a bag of ingredients plus the knife sharpener plus the measuring spoons to their door. So they do not need to leave the house. And then we will teach them all of the stuff that you would see in a cordon bleu course or a Leeds course, right? We teach them nice skills, chopping onions, you know, batch cooking. These are all important skills, but it's all part of a syllabus that the mentors walk our participants through bit by bit.
And these, as you said earlier, are people who say they can cook. I mean, is that people just bigging up their skills?
You know, most people can chase an onion around the board and chop it ultimately, but in reality, if that takes you 10 minutes to chop your onion instead of 30 seconds, which is what I can show them to do, this is all going to impact your propensity to cook, right?
On the table, we have some ingredients that might arrive in one of your Bags of Taste, and you were going to cook something for us. So what are you going to make?
We'll make chana masala, which is the first recipe on the course. It's got a lot of onions in it.
It sounds extremely complex to me, but a tin of tomatoes, a tin of chickpeas. This isn't boasting, but I do know how to chop an onion, and I'm not sure you do, Beth. So you do the chopping.
I can chop an onion, but I'm always up for improving it, because I'm certainly more about the 10 minutes than the 30 seconds.
Okay, there's 3 onions there, which is quite a lot of onions.
It is.
I usually chop the end off first. I'm doing it wrong.
Right, so do not chop the end off. So that's the first thing is peel it. And then what you do is you just chop just the kind of hairy bit off the root, just as little as you can. You really want to keep the root there to keep it together. Oh no, you've chopped too much. Don't worry, take this one. That's such a schoolgirl
Honestly, Beth.
Really? Right.
You
So
need this lesson.
Like
right?
this. Can you see this? Okay. Right. So we're going to cut the onion in half. So actually chop the top off. Sorry. Chop the top off and stand it on its head. Right. Chop your root directly from the middle, halfway straight down to the bottom. So now you've got a perfectly halved onion. Right, now on one of these halves, we're now going to chop it in a kind of sunburst shape. So I'm going to chop it like this, right? So watch where the tip of my knife is going. It is not cutting through the root. The root is going to hold everything together, okay? So I'm just doing that for illustration, but essentially like this. And when you get to the top, you go straight down, but for the sides, you go sideways. Now, Sheila, I imagine when you learnt to do this, you went straight down all the way along, and then you cut in towards the root, towards your hand, right? Because that's the classic way that they teach chefs to do it. The problem with that is that people cut themselves if they don't have good knife skills. So we always teach it this way. Yes, very good. Okay, good. And now, once you've got it like this, you just cut straight down.
you have to be a member of a vulnerable group to take advantage of bags of taste. But there are millions of middle-class people who don't cook.
So the reasons that people don't cook, largely speaking, are taste, cost and time, right? Now the problem is for people in poverty, cost is just a huge part, right, of that, which there's loads of things associated with cost, like bus fares to the supermarket, not just the cost of food.
But if you're middle class, you don't have any of those problems.
Yeah, but you've got taste, right? So you've got competition with, ready meals, takeaways that taste good, and what your kids will eat. I mean, you still have that problem. That's a problem for everybody, right? And you've got time issues. And that's why onion chopping, for example, is a great way of cutting down that time that it takes you to cook. Yeah, in it goes. Right. As you can see, there's so many onions here. There's three onions in this recipe. They're a big part of the body of the recipe, and so it's important to get that right. And that's what this recipe shows people. It shows them how to use spices, which are cheap and very accessible and can really liven up really cheap and boring ingredients.
How important, Alicia, do you think it is that there is this mentor, that there is somebody that they can ask, people doing the bags of taste course?
I think it's really critical, actually. I mean, people need to be encouraged to do it, and often they will drop out. And I think if we delivered a bag of ingredients with 3 recipes to people without the mentor and without the training and the support we give the mentors, I think you'd have only about 5% completion rate. In reality, our completion rate is over 3/4.
A lot of people will say, oh, I can cook, I'm just too lazy.
Yeah, this is a very interesting one. So in our questions in the early days, we asked people why they didn't cook, and there was all these things about how far the shops were and all this sort of stuff. But there was this one box that said "other," fill in, and one of the most common comments we got there was "I'm lazy." And I remember looking at it and thinking, well, what am I supposed to do about that? And the reality was, time and time again, I would see these people by the end of our program cooking regularly. Laziness is actually not a thing. Laziness is code for I have too many barriers. I have blunt knives, my pot doesn't have a lid, and this recipe requires it to have a lid. My kids won't eat this, that, or the other. And actually, I reckon the number of barriers is about 5. And it doesn't matter who you are, really. I mean, if you're rich, you're poor, if you've got a lot of barriers to doing something, like I will never run a marathon, you will just not even try.
The revolutionary Alicia Weston. You could say Bags of Taste is a granny for a new age, a mentor at the end of a phone line, encouraging and praising, with you on the journey to producing some great food. Bags of Taste recipes are straightforward but seriously delicious, like that chana masala made with chickpeas. Meals that make you feel better, healthier, and, happier. But what about the rest of us? As Sophie Beckett from the Birmingham Museum told us, young people are turning to new advisors on Instagram, YouTube, TikTok. In our first programme, we talked to Vicky Benison, founder of Pasta Grannies, the YouTube channel celebrating grandmas all over Italy making pasta by hand. The channel has over 1 million subscribers.
Its raison d'etre is to film grandmothers around Italy make pasta by hand. 100-year-old Verena lives in Ales in Sardinia. It's very niche. I just noticed that where I live in central Italy, it was only older women that were making pasta by hand on a daily basis. And I thought, someone should make a record of that. And it turned out that person was me.
We asked then where the UK version is, and, we easily found several, not yet on the same scale. But the UK is definitely seeing a surge in granny cooking. One engaging account is The Hungry Hooker. It has hundreds of thousands of followers on various platforms, watching Jonny Murphy, a former professional rugby player, cook, often with the woman who most influenced his love of the kitchen, his grandmother, Mamie.
2 big knobs of butter into your saucepan, melt that down. Now you got your butter melted down, chuck your onion in here. You just want to cook it down and soften it for a couple of minutes.
Put another good knob of butter in that.
So 3 big knobs of butter.
And you put your breadcrumbs and it soaks all
the butter up. When Annie said this is the traditional Christmas dinner, I would like to put garlic in this, but That was a firm no, wasn't it? You're putting your grated carrot in here. So about 5 minutes just to soften them down.
The different tastes of different generations. But that's been no barrier to Jonny and his nanny, Mamie, drawing a lot of people into their own kitchens. Producer Beth Sagar-Fenton talked to both of them.
It should be easy to cook and bake. It shouldn't be, oh, flip, this is going to take me 2 hours and it's going to be so difficult. It should be, oh, I'm enjoying doing this. And just sort of get everyone involved. And a lot of people would be like, oh, I have a grandson or a granddaughter, and I really hope, I can have that relationship. And
it reminds them of their own parents that have passed on, and they have lost their parents' recipes or their mother's recipes, and it's all bringing it back to them.
People would even come up to my nanny and when they see her out and say, oh, I made this and I made that. And it's so nice. It makes it worthwhile, if people are actually making them and enjoying them, like that's what it's all about. And I think it's unintentional in a way. I was just enjoying it and so were you. And the fact that others are enjoying it makes it even better now.
So Mamie, how did you learn to cook? Did you learn from your mum and your granny?
Well, probably from my granny as well, because she made soda bread. Because I lived with my grandparents when my mum and dad was working. And even when I started to high school, we had cookie classes then, and I loved to bake at school.
What do you make of the way that food has changed since you were Jonny's age?
I think everybody goes to the supermarket and buys their meal. They don't cook it. I've always been making soups, stews, dinners, but now you can just go into a supermarket and buy a roast dinner or whatever. All your soups is ready-made now too.
It's more convenient.
Yes, but well, you can't blame people that's out work. People's out working and have children. They can't come home and cook a full meal, at night, every night. Whereas in our day, you didn't have all that.
It's definitely better for you, homemade stuff, and it tastes better because there was someone that messaged. I was like, oh, I made your wheaten bread. And they were like, I couldn't believe there's only 4 ingredients in it, where they checked the packet that they would normally buy and there's 40 or 50.
You only 40 or 50.
I'm telling you, next time you're in the shop, you have a look. I'm telling you. I understand, when you make it fresh on the day, it's brilliant. And maybe the next day, it's still okay. But obviously, it goes off because there's no preservatives or additives. But
probably we wouldn't have any left over.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's the thing. It's all eaten anyway.
What's it like being able to share your recipes or your mum's or grandma's recipes with hundreds of thousands of people?
I just can't get my head around it that people is so interested, in wanting them. Because, all my friends can bake. Maybe even bake better than I can bake. My friend Elizabeth, it's just the way this has all happened. I'm not any better than her or better than anybody in our village,
But I think that's good in a way because, anyone can do it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's it's there to be shared and enjoyed and the long and short of it.
If there's one recipe that you're, pleased to be able to pass on, Mamie, what would it be?
Well, I suppose it's the bread, the soda bread. And
Soda farms?
Yeah, because it's so easy to make. And it's an old recipe, way back, and it's it's so easy to make.
A lot of people were looking a recipe for soda farls, so it was time to fire the griddle up at my nanny Mamie's. First add your sifted self-raising soda bread flour to a bowl. Now pour your buttermilk into a jug along with your vegetable oil and give this a mix. Gradually add this into your flour, mixing with a fork. My nanny always says it's better to be dry than too wet because you can always add a little bit more. Well, my granda said when he was younger, he would have went to his nanny's.
And she would have the griddle on.
Yeah,
that sort of thing.
Fresh off the griddle and with butter. He would say it was the butter was dripping down your hand, melting. So I think that, yeah.
There's something different, isn't there, about learning from somebody than from learning from a book, I think.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I think, and then, if you're doing something wrong, you're going to know about it is another one. You keep me right, but
I try to.
Yeah, well.
He has his ways, I have my way.
Yeah. Sometimes my nanny would be like, okay, you're making this today, but within 2 minutes you're over my shoulder telling me I'm doing something wrong. But Then again, I'd probably be the same. I think we all have our way of doing things, essentially, and you're always keeping her out. That's one thing for sure.
That's one thing for sure, you're always keeping me right. Jonny, the hungry hooker, and his grandma, Mimi. You listen to that, read the stories that poured into the food programme inbox after our first Grannies edition, and it seems not so strange that we want to take refuge in the skills and values of what seems like a more solid past, when food wasn't so controversial. Historian Polly Russell wasn't surprised by the emotion that shone through our listeners' stories, centred on their grandmother's food.
They are a signal or a shorthand for trust and for love. And I think in a food landscape where we are often unclear about the content of our food, the safety of our food, there's a lot of kind of narrative about, what we're eating and sort of quite a lot of anxiety about that. The grandma becomes a sort of shorthand for food you can really trust because it's cooked with both knowledge and skill, but also love and care, where we don't necessarily know in a kind of industrialized food landscape all the time where our food comes from and how trustworthy it is. And so I think it is very comforting in a nostalgic and perhaps not sort of historically always accurate way that this grandma figure becomes a shorthand for the food that makes us feel good.